In this episode, I'll show you how to create an HDR image.
Adorama TV presents Exploring Photography with Mark Wallace, where you will learn innovative techniques on shooting a wide range of photography. Here's your host.
Hi everybody, welcome to another episode of Exploring Photography right here on Adorama TV. Well, I'm here in Quito, Ecuador on a very busy and somewhat noisy street in front of the Basilica of the National Vow. Now this is one of the most amazing basilicas in all of South America, and I wanted to get a great picture of the interior. Now I tried to shoot that with just my camera and a single frame camera on a tripod. Well, the problem is there's so much going on that the dynamic range of my camera just wasn't large enough to fit in all the highlights and the shadows and the darks. So that meant this is a perfect candidate to shoot an HDR image. Now HDR means high dynamic range. You take multiple shots of underexposed, properly exposed, overexposed images, and you put those all together in post-production to get everything in one shot. Now, out of respect for the worshipers inside the Basilica, it's still an active church, we decided not to film inside the church itself, but I want to show you how I created this HDR image in post-production, so here's how that worked. Well, let's dive right into Lightroom 5 and I'll show you how I created my high dynamic range HDR image. Now, to create an HDR image, you need at least 3 photos. One that is exposed correctly, an underexposed, and an overexposed image. You can even do more than that. You could maybe do 5 images, 2 that are underexposed by different amounts, 2 that are overexposed by different amounts, and 1 that's exposed correctly. But you need at least 3, and I think that works well for most photos. If we look at this image right here, actually I'm going to go back here to the first image. This is the image that my camera thinks is exposed correctly, and we know that if we look over here at the EXIF data, it says exposure bias 0 EV. In other words, I didn't use any exposure compensation. I just shot using what the camera used through the lens metering to say was a correct exposure. We have some issues though. We can see way up here on the top of the Basilica, there is too much light streaming through here, so we're losing a lot of the detail. We just can't see it. It's overexposed in this area. And then at the bottom down here, underneath these pews and in the columns, we're just not seeing a lot of detail. So with an HDR image, what you'll do is in addition to your normal photo that you take, you can either use exposure compensation or bracketing in your camera. And you need to take one that is underexposed, an image that's underexposed, and an image that's overexposed by equal amounts. So I chose 2 stops. You can see over here in exposure bias, I underexposed by exactly 2 stops using exposure compensation. But look what I get when I do that. Up here, I'm now seeing the details that were missing in the other photo of the light streaming through, creating these patterns of color on the top of the Basilica. You can see now I can see my stained glass windows. Those aren't blown out. And then in my overexposed image, this is overexposed by 2 stops. You can now see that we're starting to see details in our pews and in our columns. And when we combine all of those things, we should get a shot that looks like this. This is one that I created earlier where we see all the details up here as well as all the details in the pews and on the columns. And so that's what an HDR image is. Now there's a lot of ways to create an HDR image in Lightroom. Most people will use Photoshop. They'll just export to Photoshop. I'm using some software that makes it easier. I like to do things the easiest way possible. And so let me just show you this. I am using from HDR Software is a plugin called Photomatix. This is also a standalone piece of software, and it is terrific because it really takes the complicated maneuvers of tone mapping and all this stuff that you would normally do and really makes it a simple interface. Now, this is a standalone application that looks like this. It doesn't look like much right now, but we'll see how it actually works with Lightroom. But before we do that, let's check out this contest from Adorama. So we're going to use that. And it really helps out. So what I'll do is I will select all 3 of my image, correct, underexposed, and overexposed. I will right click, and then I'm going to export this, and I'm going to export that to Photomatix Pro. And when I do that, I get this little dialog box. It's going to pop up here. It's going to give me some options. Now, the first thing that's very important to understand is your images have to line up. So you need to shoot your HDR images on a tripod. Now you can try this handheld, but if you're not really steady, and if you have really slow shutter speeds like I did on this, I had some that were 6 seconds and 20 seconds, something like that, it's just not going to work. So make sure you shoot on a tripod unless you just can't. So this will help to align things that aren't exactly lined up if there's maybe some camera shake. Also, we have some options to remove ghosts, some options there. What that means is perhaps you're shooting outside, you'll have a tree that's being blown by the wind. Well, it's going to look different in one image than the other, and so you can choose which image you want to use that still part so you don't have these sort of ghosted areas. We don't have that problem in this, but this is something that you would always leave checked. Also, reducing noise really helps out in the underexposed images. So if those dark areas, if they get a little bit noisy, Photomatix will actually take that noise out, which is really, really helpful. And I also make sure I click Reduce Chromatic Aberrations. That just helps with some of the weird fringes you get around different objects. And then I'm automatically going to re-import this into Lightroom. Later, we're going to do some sharpening in Photoshop, so we're not going to be done at the end of this. And I want to use my file name, all my combined file names, and it's just going to come in as a 16-bit TIFF image. So we'll do that. You can also do, we'll just do the file name of the first photo. That will help it be easy. Okay, so now I'm going to click Export, and Lightroom now is going to kick in, and it is actually exporting these. You can see the status. This will take a little while depending on how large your images are. Now, another important thing while this is going that I have to make sure you understand, you need to shoot in RAW mode in your camera. You can do this using JPEG images, but RAW is going to give you so much more data to work with. All right, so now these images are going to be merged, and what we have to do is we have to do something called tone mapping, where we tell our software where we want the black point to be, the white point to be, how saturated we want things to be, how big the effect is that we're using, and so that's what we're going to do next. Right now, Photomatix is asking me to help it deghost. So if we had some things here, maybe these flags shaking, or if we had some trees, we could go in here and deghost that, telling it where exactly the problems are. We don't have any problems in this, so I'm just going to say OK. Now the HDR is being merged, and we have to manipulate this to look according to the way we want this to be interpreted. So we have all kinds of artistic license here. Now I'm going to show you one of the things that just drives me nuts with HDR photos, and that's when people actually overdo it and it looks something like this. I find these pictures absolutely disgusting because it just looks horrible to me. And so it's just oversaturated. There's just too much stuff here. And so a lot of early HDR images, in fact, a lot of images out there right now have this sort of quality to them, and I just think it's disgusting. My apologies to you if you love this kind of stuff, but I like to make my images look like real photos, photorealistic. In Photomatix, there are some presets, and so you can sort of go through these presets and get a good starting point to figure out exactly where you want to go from. And so I'm going to choose here this balanced, actually this photographic, this looks a little bit too much. You can go through here, there's just a bunch of different things, and you can play with these at your leisure. Here's one that's creative. And what it's doing is it's sort of like a preset in Lightroom. So we'll go back up here. This one here is called Natural. This one's Balanced, Default. I think we'll start with Default. That looks pretty good to start with. Now the next thing we need to do is go in here and figure out exactly what we need to do on the left side here. There's different sliders that you can play with. And what I want to do first is map the white point, the black point, and the gamma. So the white point, if I slide this all the way to the left, it's saying where white begins and ends. So if I slide it to the left, we're not going to get a lot of highlights. If I slide it to the right all the way, we're going to get a lot of these highlights. So I don't want it to be so much. I'm just going to adjust this so I get details up in the sky here. And what I'll do here is I'll scale this up to 100% so we can just see that. So I want details up here in the sky without getting things overblown. So I'll play with that just a bit. So we're getting some details there. The other thing I want to do is adjust the strength, and that adjusts the overall mix between the three images. So I'm going to bring that up so it's around 90, and I'm just playing with values until I get this to look the way I want it to look here in the middle. Now the other thing we can play with here is our black point, and that's saying when does black start and end. If I go all the way to the right, we've got a lot of black. If I pull that back to the left a little bit, not so much. So I want it to be contrasty, but I don't want to lose detail in my dark areas. So I'm going to go to about right here. And again, this is a lot of adjusting to taste. The other thing that we can do here is change our gamma. The gamma is the difference between the darkest and the brightest. Think of it sort of like contrast. So if I slide it to the right here, it's a less contrasty. Slide it to the left, a little bit more contrasty. So I'm going to sort of find a balance there, and this looks pretty good to me. The other thing we can do is adjust the color temperature. I'm going to warm this up a little bit just to make it look a little bit more like it has a lot of natural light, which it did. So I will do that. And then there are a lot of other things we can do here. Detail contrast to sort of show or hide details. I'm going to increase that just a little bit. And then we also have these lighting adjustments. And the Photomatix allows you to slide this to the right for more or less adjustments. Or we can click this lighting effects mode, and it's going to choose some of these presets here that we took from over here. And so once we've done that, now we have a little bit too much going on here. So I'll adjust my gamma to bring that difference down just a little bit. I'll play with my white point, and you can see that we can play with this quite a bit until we get something that looks good exactly the way you want it to be. And that's the joy of this, is you get to choose exactly how you want your image to look. So I'll get it to be something about right here. I'm going to adjust my gamma just a little bit more. It was a little too contrasty. I like that. So once I'm done manipulating this, and normally I would maybe spend a little bit more time on this, but we've got to keep going here, I'm going to click Save and Re-import. And what that will do is it's going to save this as a TIFF image, a really high resolution TIFF image, and it will import it right back into Lightroom. And so when we zip over to Lightroom, here we go, it's going to pop back in here to Lightroom. I'm working in a collection here, so it's not going to show up in my collection. So what I'm going to do is I'm going to right click and I'm going to go to my folder in the library so we can actually see what we just did. And here is the image that we just created. Okay, I like that. That looks pretty good. But one of the things I really want for this to have is really nice detail. I want it to be really, really sharp. And right now it's not extremely sharp. It's pretty good, but I'm going to steal a trick that I learned from my friend Joel Grimes to apply to this image. So what I'll do here is I'm going to right click on this and I'm going to edit this in Photoshop. And this is the last step. I'm going to edit a copy of this with Lightroom Adjustments so that way I can play with it. So now this is going to open up in Photoshop, and what I'll do is I'm going to increase this to full size, and you can see we have just lots of detail here. I'm going to create a copy of the background, and then I will create a filter. I'm going to go to Other, then I'm going to create a high pass filter. Now this is sort of like a sharpening filter. What I want to do here is I want to adjust my radius until I just see the outlines of the edges of the objects that I'm trying to sharpen. So I'm going to do this. I'm going to take this radius down just a bit. So I just want it to be very, very light. You might not be able to see this because of the compression of this video that you're watching. So this looks sort of like this gray outline over the top. What I need to do is go to my Layers panel, change this to Overlay. When I do, that really makes this pop. And if you want a stronger effect, then you adjust that radius so it's a little bit more than what it was. And now we can look at this image in full resolution and look at the detail in this. We have our highlights, we have our shadows. You can see every single thing in this image. It is just crystal clear, and that is what I want to see in my HDR image. And so if we played with this a little bit more, we'll go back over here to Lightroom. I'll show you the image that I originally created. It's back here in my folder here in my HDR Basilica. Here we go. And this is the finished product. If I'd spent a little bit of time on this, this is how I like it to look. So the tone mapping looks very natural. The color temperature looks very natural. Normally I would spend about 30 minutes to an hour dialing this all in, and I'm sure you don't want to watch me do that. But by adjusting those sliders, you can make this look like a photo that is super realistic and not overdone. Well, that's how I created my image of the Basilica of the National Vow. Now remember, there's more to talk about with HDR images, and you can find all that information at the Adorama Learning Center. It's totally free, so check it out. And don't forget, you can subscribe to Adorama TV for free, and so that way you don't miss a single episode. Well, thank you so much for joining me today, and I'll see you again in the next episode.
Do you want great-looking prints at low cost? Be sure to visit our easy-to-use online printing service. Adorama Pix has professionals who treat your images with the utmost care that you can count on. For a quick turnaround on photos, cards, or albums, use AdoramaPix.com.